Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to another session of our ongoing online lecture series. Today, we are joined by an eminent academician, someone that I personally look up to for his range of reading, for his conviction, and also for his wonderful command over the language in which he articulates his thought. He is Professor Niladri Chatterjee, who teaches at the Department of English, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. Niladri Chatterjee is a widely published author, and if we try to go on naming all the articles, all the important articles that he has published in various journals of national and international repute, it would take me at least 15 minutes. So let's not do that. What I'm going to do, I'm going to try to introduce Professor Chatterjee in a very brief way. We can say that Professor Niladri Chatterjee is an professor, academician, activist, as well as a novelist. His doctoral work was on the novelist Christopher Isherwood, a recipient of Fulbright Scholarship and the British Council Charles Wallace Fellowship. He co-edited The Muffled Heart, Stories of the Disempowered Male, contributed to the American Isherwood, and so on. He has published in the journal American Notes and Queries, Intersections, and has recently begun contributing to The Wire. He has reviewed for Gay and Lesbian Review Worldwide from the US, and he has been teaching a course very successfully in gender studies at his university since 2009. In 2016, his first novel, as of now the only novel, The Scholar, came out. Tonight or this evening, I was saying tonight because his lecture is entitled Esta Noche, which means tonight. Niladrida, I call him Niladrida, is going to speak on American literature, and this is a coincidence that his address falls on the 4th of July, which is the Independence Day of America. And I personally requested him to speak on American literature, and he has chosen to speak on the poetry of Mark Doty. So tonight, his address will be entitled as Esta Noche, the poetry of Mark Doty. And without further ado, I now humbly request Professor Niladri Chatterjee to please deliver his address. And I thank him profusely for accepting our request and giving us the go note for delivering a lecture for our college. This is a pleasure and a privilege. So Niladrida, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. Thank you for giving the opportunity to speak to your students. It is always a pleasure to be speaking to young minds. My only regret is that I can't see them, but my consolation is that I'm hoping that everybody can see me from where they are. Um, Thank you also for giving me this opportunity to talk about a poet who is not very well known. But I think that his poetry deserves to be well known, particularly at a time like this, when we are beginning to grapple with certain very important questions regarding what it means to be alive, what it means to be living in the time of a pandemic, what it means to be extremely well aware of race and about racism everywhere in India. We may not have racism in that kind of format, but we certainly have communalism. We certainly have casteism. So it is very important for us to try and recognize that poetry and indeed literature and indeed the arts have a very vital role to play in trying to make us aware sometimes of the human aspect, the personal, the deeply felt personal aspect of lives, which is sometimes perhaps clouded over in the newsprint, in the news media. So I think that literature has a very important role to play. The reason why I also chose Mark Doty today is because Mark Doty has just published a book which is very difficult to classify. Is it autobiography? Is it a memoir? Is it a biography? Is it a long essay? I personally think it has just struck me that it is a long essay. It is a book length essay. It is a book length essay on Walt Whitman. It is a book length essay on Mark Doty's very personal engagement with the 19th century poet, in which Mark Doty tries to understand what makes Whitman important today. What is it about Whitman's poetry that still resonates today? Whitman was just as angered by slavery as a lot of people in America are angered by racism. So there are real resonances between the poetry of Walt Whitman and Mark Doty's poetry, and there are resonances between what Mark Doty wrote in 1995 in the book My Alexandria, which is the book that I'm going to read today from, and what we are facing today. But before I go on to Mark Doty, I would want to talk a little bit about what we understand by poetry as such. So I'll take a little bit of time to talk about what it means to be a poet, what it means to be writing poetry. Now, many of you, including me, I'm sure, when I was younger, we all wrote poetry. And there is a tendency in many of us, not all, thankfully, but in many of us, there is a tendency to write poetry when we are unhappy. Now, I understand that there is a certain way of dealing with unhappiness. So, therefore, one way of dealing with unhappiness can be to cry, which I always support. There can be a way of dealing with unhappiness by talking about it to someone, whether on the telephone or on mobile or through WhatsApp. But some people also believe that maybe unhappiness is a good place from where to start writing poetry. Now, the problem with that is that very often when we are writing poetry in the midst of unhappiness, we are so completely involved in ourselves that we forget that poetry is also a craft. So, since poetry is also a craft, it therefore needs some kind of distance. You need to be able to read what you have written, and you need to be able to say, oh my God, what I have written is absolute rubbish. I am going to scratch it out and I'm going to start again. And then you write it afresh, and then you're still dissatisfied. So as a result of many scratchings out, you finally arrive at a poem that you think you may like. Now, when you are correcting yourself, when you are scratching out the lines that you have written yourself, what does it mean? What it means is that you have distanced yourself from the poetry. So the suffering self and the poet self have been separated. And it is this distancing of the suffering self from the poet self which many of us tend to forget when we are writing poetry in the midst of unhappiness. We also write poetry when we fall in love, yes? So therefore, but when we fall in love, we usually write poetry when the person is not receiving our phone calls, or when the person is not returning our text messages. That is when we start to feel unhappy, and immediately a horrible poem comes out. So we tend to think of poetry as an intensely subjective exercise. And those of us who think of poetry as an intensely subjective exercise, I think reading Mark Doty might be a very good antidote. Because what Mark Doty does in poem after poem after poem is that he talks about other people. He does not write so much about what is going on in his life. He writes about what he is seeing when he is going out. Yes, he writes about other people's suffering, not about his own. So there is a way in Mark Doty, there is a way in which we can learn from Mark Doty that he has managed to create a kind of poetry. He's not the only one. There are several other poems who've done that, other poets who've done that. But he has managed to create a poetry which isn't so overtly subjective. Of course, it is always going to be subjective because it is the consciousness of Mark Doty that is looking at the world, that is looking at people, that is looking at buildings, that is looking at objects. But it is also the Mark Doty that says, yes, but I'm not interested in my suffering. I'm interested in finding beauty out there. So, in this particular group of poems that we have, he writes on a variety of issues. Since I promised Shoikot that I'll be speaking on Mark Doty, I have been reading this volume of poems, and the astonishing diversity of subjects is something that we can all learn from. So, let me give an idea as to what kind of things Mark Doty writes about. He writes about the demolition of a building, not about the demolition of his heart, about the demolition of a building. He writes a poem called Heaven, which is about a woman friend of his who works for a certain period of time, and then with the money that she has, she simply likes to live on the street. And there's this rather amazing line that he has. He says, she says she likes waking, knowing she can be anyone she wants to keep, any name, as long as it wears well. So he says that the reason why I admire her so much is because she says she likes waking, knowing she can be anyone she wants, keep any name, as long as it wears well. We have his poem called Human Figures, which is about a man on a bus who is making human figures out of newspapers. And then, in a very interesting way, he links that idea of newspapers that are building little human beings to somebody who lies on the road bleeding, and there are newspapers that are blowing in the breeze, and these newspapers also soak some of the blood that this man is sort of letting out of his body. And he produces this rather astonishing line, because he's talking about how the newspapers are coming to this bleeding body, soaking some of the blood, and then the wind is carrying them on. He says, imagine he'd keep on publishing himself until his outline were larger than anything the police could chalk, uncontained, the shapeless bulletin of the news you can't buy, though you can't help but read it. So therefore, there is a way in which Mark Doty is saying that when the newspapers are actually carrying that man's blood to various parts of the city, the man, as it were, is publishing himself. That is an extraordinary idea. I'm not going to go through all of the poems that he has written, because there are about 2 or 3 poems that I would want to specifically concentrate on today. But the second thing that I would want to talk about in the context of what is poetry. So the first thing that I've already told you is that poetry is not about being self-obsessed. It is also about looking at the beauty that lies outside of you, the beauty that lies around you. So maybe the next time you go out, well, I know that these days it is a little difficult to go out, but doesn't matter. You can also look at the household objects that you have lying around your house, and you can certainly find beauty there, something that you perhaps never paid much attention to. So one should try to look out and to find beauty that is outside. Of course, you are going to talk about your suffering. Of course, you're going to talk about your personal joys and sorrows, but there's a way of doing it. And this is what I'm going to come to when I'm talking about what it means to be a poet and what does poetry do. What poetry does is that it is the most intense exercise in the stretching of language. That is what I think I would want you to pay attention to, is that it is an intense exercise of shaping the language. Mark Doty talks about newspapers soaking up the blood of a bleeding man on the street, and that newspaper blowing away everywhere. And the verb that he uses is publishing. He could have used soak, he could have used wet, he could have used moist, but he uses publishing. So therefore, what Mark Doty does is that he takes the word publishing and he uses it in a way that we are completely unfamiliar with. See, that is poetry. And that is what we really need to learn to do. So the next time you sit down to write a poem, ask yourself this one simple question: how am I stretching the language? How am I doing something with the words that haven't been done before? Think of yourself as a personal trainer. Think of yourself as somebody who is an instructor at a gym. What does the instructor at a gym do? The instructor of a gym constantly tells the customers of the gym to do more push ups, to do more this, to do more that. And of course, the customers, they complain. They say, no, I don't want to do it. My body is hurting. I don't want to do it. But the gym instructor keeps on forcing them. What the gym instructor does to the bodies of the customers, you as a poet are expected to do to the language. That is what being a poet is. So when the gym instructor is forcing the customers to do one more push-up, to do one more curl, to do one more stretch, yes, the gym instructor is not doing it for any personal reasons. He's doing it as a professional duty. And maybe that is something that we should also try to inculcate within ourselves, is that we must be professional. When I say professional, I don't necessarily mean that we must always want to earn money, because heavens knows poets don't earn a lot of money. But you have to be able to be professional enough to say, this is a craft. This is a craft that I will have to get good at. This is not about my suffering. This is not about my happiness. This is not about my joy. So that is something that I would want you to remember. Okay, having said that, the first poem that I think I would really want to read from is, so I'm going to read, I think I'm going to read three or four poems. The first poem that I shall read is called Brilliance. Now, Brilliance is a poem which was written by Mark Doty in memory of a friend who was nursing somebody who was dying. So here is, I mean, we can somehow guess that the man was perhaps dying of AIDS, but we are not entirely sure. But this is something which Mark Doty is making out of the suffering of this man who is near death. Brilliance is basically about somebody, about somebody who is being given a last chance to look at beauty. That is broadly what it is about. And the poem is about Mark Doty's friend Maggie, this lady who is taking care of the man who is dying. Brilliance. Maggie's taking care of a man who's dying. He's attended to everything, said goodbye to his parents, paid off his credit card. She says, why don't you just run it up the limit? But he wants everything squared away, no balance owed. Though he misses the pets he's already found a home for. He can't be around dogs or cats. Too much risk. He says, I can't have anything. She says, a bowl of goldfish? He says he doesn't want to start with anything, and then describes the kind he'd maybe like, how their tails would fan to a gold flaring, They talk about hot jewel tones, gold lacquer, say maybe they'll go pick some out, though he can't go much of anywhere. And then abruptly he says, I can't love anything I can't finish. He says it like he's had enough of the world, of the scintillating world. Though what he means is he'll never be satisfied and therefore has established this discipline, a kind of severe rehearsal. That's where they leave it. Him looking out the window, her knitting as she does because she needs to do something. Later, he leaves a message. Yes to the bowl of goldfish, meaning, let me go if I have to, in brilliance. In a story I read, a Zen master who'd perfected his detachment from the things of the world remembered at the moment of dying a deer he used to feed in the park and wondered who might care for it, and at that instant was reborn in the stunned flesh of a fawn. So Maggie's friend, is he going out into the last loved object of his attention, fanning the veined translucence of an opulent tail, undulant in some uncapturable curve? Is he bronze chrysanthemums, copper leaf, hurried darting, doubloons, icon colored fins, troubling the water? So there you have it. You have this extraordinary poem about. It could be about several things. It could also be about the transmigration of soul. So just as the Zen master had got into the deer that he once loved, Mark Doty is wondering if the dead man has now gone into the goldfish that was the last thing that he owned. So it is about, see, there are many ways of writing about death, right? But when we write about death, it is always a very negative, very gloomy, very dark way in which we talk about death. But here, Mark Doty manages to do something rather extraordinary. He infuses a poem about death with brilliance. He infuses death with color, with happiness, with, ironically enough, life. So when he's talking about life in a poem about death, do you realize that he's also in a certain way changing what we understand by death? So I think this is a rather remarkable achievement, and which is why this is absolutely one of my favorite poems of Mark Doty. Now, we should particularly pay attention to this poem now because, of course, we are now living at a time when every single day we are hearing about people dying. And it is not good news. It doesn't cheer us up. But maybe what we should try to remember is that even when some are dying at this in this terrible way, maybe what is human and what would be the kind thing to do is to, even in their last moments, try to give their lives some kind of beauty, some kind of color, some kind of positivity, so that they can, in Mark Doty's words, what does he say? He says, let me go if I have to, in brilliance. And this is not just about one person dying. It isn't just about people dying in a pandemic, because when Mark Doty is writing these poems, America is in the midst of the AIDS crisis. People are dying everywhere. And there is a real similarity between the AIDS crisis and the coronavirus crisis that we're living in right now. Because then, as now, the governments of many, many countries were incredibly callous. They did not pay attention. They had the lockdown, but they were extremely eager to lift the lockdown as soon as possible so that business can flourish again. So then the consideration of money was much greater than consideration for the safety of human life. Let us open up the shopping malls. Let us open up the restaurants. Let us open up the hairdressers. So, therefore, it is almost as though the economy is taking precedence over the lives of people. And this was the same thing that was happening in America during the AIDS crisis, when the government was simply not paying attention to the hundreds and thousands of people who were dying. It didn't matter to the government. So we move on now to a poem which I have selected. Well, actually, there are two poems that I have selected because I believe that these two poems of Mark Doty have special resonance for the way in which we are looking at the Black Lives Matter movement that has been going on in America for quite some time now. Many of you may be aware of the fact that Black Lives movement was started recently because of the horrible way in which the black man George Floyd was killed, basically by white policemen. And so there were a lot of people who were out there in the streets protesting. Now, that was very good, but something else began to happen. In the demonstrations for Black Lives Matter, obviously there were a lot of black people, and that is only right. And there were many people who were not white, who were not black, and they were also a part of the demonstration, which is also a very good thing. But there was a slightly discordant note in the demonstrations because in some parts of America, when trans persons started to join the demonstration, or when gay black men, or when lesbian black women, or black lesbian women, or black gay men, and black trans persons, black trans men, black trans women started to take part in these demonstrations, there were people, other black people, who were basically treating them badly in the demonstration. So it seemed as though Black Lives Matter, but mostly it is the cis Black lives that matter. It is the heterosexual Black lives that matter. That was the unintended, unconscious message that some people were giving out, even in the midst of protesting against the killing of George Floyd. So then, not only were the cries of Black Lives Matter circulating across America, but added to that were other cries of all Black Lives Matter. Trans Black Lives Matter. These were the slogans that people started to shout because they felt that the Black Lives Matter was becoming more like heterosexual Black Lives Matter, cis Black Lives Matter. And we are going to also broaden the definition of Black because in the poem that I am reading over here, this particular poem, Esta Noche, is set in a Latino area of California. And it is about a bar, which is a drag bar. So this is where trans women, this is where drag queens, that is to say, men who enjoy wearing women's clothes, they come over here and perform. And this is called Esta Noche. And this is what this poem is about. Esta Noche. In a dress with a black tulip's sheen, La Fabulosa Lola enters, late, mounts the stairs to the plywood platform, and begs whoever runs the wobbling spot to turn the lights down to something flattering. When they halo her with a petal-toned gel, she sets to haranguing, shifting in and out of two languages like gowns or genders, to please have a little respect for the girls, flashing the one entrancing and unavoidable gap in the center of her upper teeth. And when the cellophane drop goes black, a new spot coronas her in a wig fit for the end of a century. And she tosses back her hair, risky gesture, and raises her arms like a widow in a blood tragedy, all will and black lace, and lip syncs you and me against the world. She's a man you wouldn't look twice at in street clothes. 200 pounds of hard living, the gap in her smile sadly narrative. But she's a monument in the mysterious permission of the dress. This is Esta Noche, a Latin drag bar in the mission. Its black door a gap in the face of a battered wall. All over the neighborhood, storefront windows show all night shrined hats and gloves, wedding dresses, first communions, frothing lace, gowns of perfection and commencement, fixed promises glowing. In the dress, the color of the spaces between street lamps, Lola stands unassailable. The dress in which she is, in the largest sense, fabulous. A lesson, a criticism, and colossus of gender, all fire and irony. Her spine's perfectly erect, only her fluid hands moving and her head turning slightly to one side. She hosts the pageant Wednesdays and Saturdays, and men come in from the streets, the trains, and the repair shops, lean together to rank the artifice of the awkward or lovely. Lola welcomes onto the stage Victoria, Elena, Francie. Lame pumps and stockings, and always the rippling night pulled down over the broad shoulders and flounced around the hips. Liquid, the black silk of Esta Noche, proving that perfection and beauty are so alien they almost never touch. Tonight, she says, put it on. The costume is license and calling. She says you could wear the whole damn black sky and all its spangles. It's the only night we have to stand on. Put it on. It's the only thing we have to wear. When I first read this poem many, many years ago, I was astonished by several lines. The first one that actually screamed out at me is that she's a man, you wouldn't look twice at street clothes. She's a man. So therefore, that astonishing line, she's a man, is rather wonderful because it isn't paying tribute to masculinity the way in which patriarchy uses the term. Oh, mard ka bachcha. She is so straight, she's so courageous, she's so brave, she's a man. That is not the sense in which it is being used over here. It is being used as a simple way in which people designate others. She's a man, he's a woman. These are sentences that sound grammatically incorrect. It should be he is a man, she's a woman. But look how Mark Doty is actually, what is he doing? He is stretching the language. He is making the words do what the words had never done before. Nobody thinks of writing she's a man. Mark Doty does it. And also, something which I thought was really rather wonderful was when he says that she says you could wear the whole damn black sky and all its spangles. It's the only night we have to stand on. Put it on. It's the only thing we have to wear. So therefore, can we therefore begin to understand clothes as a political weapon? What we wear, how we wear it, we are making a political statement. And that is something that I think we should also be aware of, is over here, cross-dressing, wearing the clothes of another gender is, of course, it is being done to entertain the men who are sitting there in front of them, but it is also about claiming an identity. It is also about demanding respect for who you are. It is also about saying that gender is not stable. that gender is fluid, that she can be a man. And I am going to move on now to another poem, which I think is rather important for us to keep in mind. This is a poem that Mark Doty wrote also to talk about the way in which people deal with lives, about pain, about suffering. And here, I would actually want to talk about Chanteuse. Now, Chanteuse is a really longish poem, so I'll probably not read too much of it. But Chanteuse is a rather interesting poem because, again, in this poem, you actually have another drag queen, but in this case, the drag queen is actually black. So, therefore, Chanteuse has got real resonance for what we are living in right now. I'm just going to read a little section to make you aware of what is going on over here. Okay, so this is from the middle of the poem. In a nearly empty room over a crowded bar, a beautiful black drag queen perched on the edge of the piano under a blue spot, her legs crossed in front of her so that the straps of her sparkling ankle shoes glimmered, sang only to us. The song was Rogers and Hart. My romance does not have to have a moon in the sky. And she was perfect. The piano slow unfolding, her smoke burnished, entirely believable voice, the sequins on her silver bolero shimmering ice blue. Cavafy ends a poem of regret and desire. He had no other theme than memories erotics, his ashen atmosphere, by going out onto a balcony, to change my thoughts at least by seeing something of this city I love, a little movement in the streets, in the shops. That was all it took to console him, some token of Alexandria's anarchic life. How did it go on without him? The city he transformed into feeling. Hadn't he made it entirely into himself? High windy blue, I wrote, in one of those old notebooks one never really reads again, burning over the balconies. Whose city was it? Prendergast's? Cavafy's? The rapt singer who caught us in the glory of her artifice? I'll stop there. But there are several things that are happening in this poem. Those of you who have the opportunity to get an e-book version of My Alexandria, please go ahead and buy it or download it because I think it's a rather powerful volume as far as our understanding of the life outside is concerned. He is, of course, talking about the Black Drag Queen. The reason why I read that piece, I've already explained. But he also mentions another two artists over here. He mentions a songwriting couple, Rogers and Hart, who were lyricists who wrote songs in America. And he mentions a Greek poet, Constantine Cavafy. Now, one has to understand what is going on over here and look at how poetry is capable of transgressing, of crossing over, of crossing borders of race, of crossing borders of nationality, of even crossing borders of language. Rogers and Hart, let us remember, were white. And the person who is singing this song is black. Rogers and Hart, let us remember, was a man who lived in America and wrote songs in America. Cavafy was a man who lived in America and wrote songs in America. Okay. I think we are back now. So I don't know how much of you were able to catch the last few things that I said, but Rogers and Hart are white, and the singer over here is black. Rogers and Hart were men. The singer over here is a woman. Rogers and Hart were cis, and the person over here is trans. So there are several identities that are being crossed over. And when we are talking about Cavafy, well, Cavafy was Greek. This particular person is American. Cavafy wrote in Greek. This person is singing in English. And so, therefore, nationalities, genders, um, race, so many things are being crossed. And I think this is what we really have to remember when we are doing poetry, is that poetry does not, and that is absolutely where I'm going to finish my talk, after which you can certainly ask me some questions. But this is what poetry does. I think poetry crosses boundaries. Literature crosses boundaries. So, therefore, no poem ever stands in isolation. No poem ever stands in an emptiness. Every poem is linked to a million other poems. And this is something that Mark Doty makes us aware. So, the next time you say that I am only going to read poems from my own culture, that I think is a terrible mistake, because your own culture is not all that pure either. Every culture is mixed up with innumerable other cultures. And the fact that all cultures are so gloriously impure, it is this lovely, generative, productive impurity that poetry does. And that is something that we should all be very grateful for. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Niladri, for this fascinating, thought-provoking talk. I believe that many of us would now turn to the poetry of Mark Doty and try to relate to his poetry as you have asked us or encouraged us to do. Thank you once again. You have always been wonderful a speaker to listen to. So now that we have got a bit of time, I
Yes.
request everyone who has tuned in to our YouTube channel to please put your questions. I'm sure there are going to be some. Put your questions in the comment box, and I asked our head of the department, Professor Tanmay Kundu, to please either read them out to Niladri or to type them out in the private chat box in which he can see them.
So
So Tanmay, could
Yes.
you?
one thing I can do, I can make it visible to you on a screen, and I can see
Yes.
that.
Yeah, that would be
Sure.
like a good thing. So the
Ah,
first question.
yes. So I think I can see Rahul Sen, who says, can we say that there are different idioms of poetry? For instance, the Romantic school of poetry will talk about personal suffering, while the Modernist school of poetry will emphasize on distance. Yes, yes, that is very true. Rahul, thank you for your question. Very nice of you to have come over to listen to me. That is absolutely true. But even when the Romantic school talks about the personal suffering, they are also very careful to remember that maybe personal suffering will not be the real raison d'etre of the poetry. They never forgot about the craft. So even when they were talking about personal suffering, they were still constantly choosing the words very carefully, and they were constantly saying, oh, no, this is not the right line, that is not the right line. So even when they're talking about personal suffering, they are still trying to craft a poem. So the craftsmanship of poetry is something even the romantic poets never forgot. So I think I've got to Rahul's question, but yeah.
So it's time for having questions. So I request our participants, if they have any observation or question or thought in their mind, they can drop in the comment section of YouTube. We are here for that. You can write them down.
Niladri, can you
Yes.
hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can.
As
Yeah.
you're as you are waiting for other questions to come up, I was just wondering,
Yes.
for the sake
Oh,
of
the
yeah, yeah, please
no,
answer me.
no. You can ask me. Okay, can poetry be fully objective? No, no, absolutely. No, poetry can never be fully objective. Nothing can ever be fully objective. Even a research paper is not fully objective. Even historians are not fully objective. Even journalists are not fully objective. So objectivity, of course, is a myth. Nobody can be fully objective, but there is certainly something to be said for the craftsmanship. So I think that if you are an artist, you should be able to have the kind of critical distance from where you can read what you have written, and you should be able to be honest enough and rigorous enough to be able to say this is terrible. So therefore it isn't about being emotionally distanced from what is going on. No, be completely emotionally engaged. And nobody should ever have been fully objective in any era. Forget about modern, in any era. So I'm not suggesting that people can be entirely objective. Be subjective, but experience the world that is around you, but at the same time have the kind of honesty, the honesty of an artist to be able to say that was a horrible line that I wrote, and I'm not going to allow that line to stay. I am going to change it. So that's what I broadly meant, is to be more faithful to your craft than to your feelings. What makes poetry a distinct literature? I think what makes poetry distinct literature is because I think poetry is literature in a concentrated form. It is like itra. It is like fragrance. When you buy a very strong perfume, you don't get a really big bottle of it. You get a tiny bottle of it. It is concentrated, and if you just put one drop of it behind your ear, then the entire room starts to sort of experience the fragrance of it. Poetry is like that. Poetry is literature in a concentrated form, which is why poems are usually short, and which is why it is concentrated, which is why a lot of people find it very difficult to read. They say, oh, I don't like poetry. Well, the reason why they don't like poetry is because they don't like the way in which the poets have concentrated the language. Because when you concentrate something, it automatically becomes richer, and many people may not be able to take it. Parul Soni writes, study of culture is essential for the realization of the actual essence of any genre. How can we understand culture from perspective of theory, or do you mean how can we understand culture from the perspective of poetry? I hope you mean how can we understand culture from the perspective of poetry. In so many ways. I think one can understand culture from the perspective of poetry I can think of only two. There may be more than that. One is what you are allowed to write and what you are not allowed to write, right? So therefore, there is a certain kind of inbuilt censorship that is constantly working within us. So even when we try to write a poem, we sort of think, oh, I don't know if I write this poem, if people read it, what are they going to think of me, right? So then there is a kind of internal censorship that works that prevents you from writing stuff, which I think is terrible. I think you should just ignore that internal censorship and you should write whatever you want to do. But on the positive side, what culture also does is that you can understand the culture by looking at the poetry and by seeing how that poetry engages with so-called other cultures. It can be the culture of a different language, it can be the culture of a different country, it can be the culture of a different caste, race. So therefore, because poetry, like literature, can be very transgressive, I think you can tell how strong a culture is by how accommodating and how wonderfully celebratory it is of various other cultures. So that is a good way of finding out about culture from poetry. Preetu Haldar from Jadavpur University, can the poetry, I hope you mean, can the poetry of Mark Doty be called autoethnographic? It could be. It could be, yes, it could be autoethnographic. It can, some people can also call it ethnography. So there are many, many ways in which you can certainly look at Mark Doty's poetry. Yes, you can do that, Pritu. That is a good way of describing Mark Doty. Ononna Mukherjee writes, can we then consider that Mark Doty therefore problematized concept of androgyny? He doesn't problematize it. I don't think. I think what he does is he celebrates it, and of course now Ononna, I have started to move away from the term androgyny, because I think androgyny kind of implies the coexistence of the andros and the gynos, so therefore the male and the female. I no longer know what is male, I no longer know what is female. So therefore I am a little skeptical about using the word androgyny now, but I don't think Mark Doty problematizes. I think he celebrates it. I think he celebrates androgyny, and he celebrates androgyny as something that is beautiful. It is something that is beautiful. It is something that is glamorous. It is something that sort of makes people happy. So he puts a very, very positive spin on androgyny in the face of the patriarchal denigration of androgyny that we see all around us. Shoikot Chakraborty, as you were talking about stretching the language, what is your comment on avant-garde stretching of form? Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that this is what literature should do. I think this is what culture should do, is that you should stretch form, you should stretch genre, right? So, which is why when, this is where I think I began to talk about it at the beginning of my talk, that Mark Doty has just published a book about his personal engagement with Walt Whitman. Can everybody hear me? I'm getting a peculiar squeaky sound. Anyway, so what Mark Doty is doing is, he has just published a book on Walt Whitman. And remember, what Walt Whitman was doing is that he was very much stretching form, right? And I think this stretching of form is also something that Mark Doty has done with his book on Walt Whitman, because there are people now who are asking him, bookshops, who are asking him, please tell us, where do we stock your book? In which shelf does your book go? Because it is not autobiography, it is not biography, it is, what is it? It's not creative writing, it's not, what is it? So therefore, I think that Mark Doty has managed to produce a book that is so difficult to put in an appropriate shelf in the bookshop, is his way of stretching form as well. So thank you, Shoigot, for your wonderful question. Mrinmoy Ghosh asks, how far can we call Mark Doty's poem universal, considering the present worldview? I don't quite remember which writer had said it, but somebody had said, and it's a rather wonderful line. Somebody had once said, this was a novelist, and the novelist was, I wish I could give you the name of the writer, but this novelist was asked about how much detail one can put in the fiction, because if you put in too much detail, will it not alienate people who don't know that culture? And this particular writer had said, on the contrary, what you should understand is that the more particular you become, the more universal you become. Because if you keep it too vague, people are not going to be able to imagine what is the situation that you're talking about. So you have to be particular. But because once you are particular, then that particularity is going to resonate with your kind of particularities, which may not be the same, but it is certainly a way of probing the human condition. And you can only probe the human condition by going into the depths, not by skimming the surface. What are the differences between the poetry of Mark Doty and Walt Whitman? Oh, that is a good question. Differences. I think you've got me there. Because I'm constantly thinking about the similarities. I don't very often think about the differences. I think that time, only time. Walt Whitman was writing in the 19th century. Mark Doty is writing in the 20th century. So Walt Whitman is using cultural references that he had access to. Mark Doty is using cultural references that he has access to. So both poems are different in the sense that they lived at different times. But I think that there are far too many similarities that are there. If you talk about the way in which they are celebrating the outdoors, the way in which they are both interested in museums, the way in which their poetry is homoerotic, the way in which Whitman celebrates the male body, also talks about physical intimacy between men. This is something that Mark Doty does as well. He talks about receiving, for example, a blowjob, in the park in his poem Days of 1981. So there are far too many similarities. Differences, different times. I think that's what it is. But a wonderful question, Snehashish. Thank you. Debabrata Odhikari, do you think in reading Mark Doty's poem there is an emphasis on poetry, art, and self needing to reach out to the distressed, troubled, marginal other instead of self-advertising? Oh, that is a brilliant point. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that Mark Doty is trying to reach out. That is absolutely true. This is all his poems. What a brilliant way of describing Mark Doty's poetry. All of his poems are exercises in reaching out. That is absolutely true. He is reaching out because he is writing about lives that he would never live. He is writing about these lives that are never going to be his. But he feels that these lives have enough beauty, enough dignity in them that they require his artistic attention. And that is why he gives it to them. So yes, Mark Doty's poetry is the poetry of reaching out. Excellent. Devdatta Shaha, sir, you were talking about critical distancing. Some of the initial poems of Robert Browning were difficult to read and understand. Yes, I know. Difficult to read and understand. Is it because of lack of critical distancing which he later had? I don't know. This is something that Devdatta I actually have not thought about. But then I'm not terribly well read in Browning, so I may not be able to comment. But it is possible. It is something to look into. It is something to look into. Maybe there's a paper in there somewhere. You should consider writing a paper on it.
Sir, this is the last questions we will take for this session.
Yes, yes. Rakshanda Naeem, how can we be more faithful and honest in poetry as a craft? Please elaborate. A wonderful question, and I will. This is possibly the best question that I could have had at the end of the session. When I talk about the honesty, I talk about the honesty of a poet. I talk about the honesty of a craftsman, right? So when you are writing a poem, you see, if we are really see what is honesty? Honesty is probing deep into something to reach the heart of it, right? Now, many of us, when we write a poem, we are so satisfied with the very first draft of it that we say, oh, this is perfect. This is perfect. I'm not going to touch it. It's amazing. It's amazing. Maybe it isn't all that amazing. So if you are honest as a craft, you are going to say, well, actually, I think the second line is rubbish. Actually, I think the fourth line has to be reordered. I think the second stanza is terrible, right? So when I'm talking about honesty, I'm talking about the honesty of the practitioner of the craft. You should be honest enough to look at what you have produced and to realize that it isn't very good, that it requires improvement. That is the honesty that I'm talking about. But thank you so much for that wonderful question.
So as this was the last question for the session, um, we can declare that we have come to the end of a brilliant and a very engaging session. An interactive session with Professor Chatterjee is always very engaging. So we thank him, and to formally offer the vote of thanks, may I now request Susmita from our PG second semester student of Midnapore College Autonomous to please offer the formal vote of thanks. Tanma, is Susmita here? Tanma, is your microphone on the mute?
Yes, Tanmay, yeah.
She's here. Susmita,
Has he joined? With these new platforms being tried almost every day, people are taking time to get adjusted to. There are
But it
so
is a
many.
very good platform. I'm very happy with the picture quality. I'm very happy with the sound quality. I have been on GoToWebinar, Zoom, Google Meet, all sorts of platforms. But this is good. This is the first time that I'm on this platform, and its StreamYard is good. I'll recommend it to other people.
Is Susmita here,
so
Tanma?
no, she's not able to join. I think she has
Okay.
got disconnected right now.
Okay.
So technical hassles that we cannot tide over,
Right.
and things that we have to get adjusted to as we are going to be more and more online. Um, our second speaker, Professor Debapriya Paul of Calcutta University, has joined us. Now is the time to offer a formal vote of thanks to Professor Niladri Chatterjee, who has been kind enough to accept our invitation. It has always been a pleasure to listen to him, and I personally am terribly fond of his articulation. And it's just like that. It takes me a little time to go to what he's saying, but for the first 5 minutes, for the first 5 or so minutes, I'm fascinated by how he is saying it. So, and it has this habit of mine has not become old, because I have been listening to Niladri for almost 7 or 8 years now. But he is still
Yes.
as charming and as fascinating as he has been when the first time I've heard him. So this has again been a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to listen to him. It's very kind of him to take some time out of his otherwise very busy schedule. And I hope that in better times he would be kind enough to again grace our college with his presence. We have had him once over,
Yes.
and that was a
Yes.
fascinating session. Despite the rains, it was raining very heavily on that day, and still we had a wonderful session, a very alive session as it is. So again, by formally thanking him and thanking our head of the department and all those who have very kindly joined us on the YouTube channel, we thank him from the core. We thank everyone from the core of our hearts. And now let us move on to our second session, Professor Debapriya Paul of Calcutta University.
I can stay on and listen, can't
Yeah,
I?
absolutely, Neil.
Yeah.
Please stay on. That would be lovely.
Okay. I'll just put my phone on mute.
Tanmay, please take over.
Yes. The brother.
Niladri, but it's also very intimidating for me, indeed, to have your presence, because I have not much to offer as way, the scholars' way is concerned.
The brother, we can see you. If you please turn on your video on. Yes. It's okay now.
Okay, can I do the share screen?
Before that, am I audible?
Yes.
So, on behalf of the Department of English, Midnapore College, I feel honored and equally privileged to have you with us. So, for our participants, I like to introduce you. Today, in second session, we have with among us the Debapriya Paul from Calcutta University. Sir, he is an assistant professor serving in Calcutta University. Before that, he joined in the University of Gorbongo, Malda, where he served up to 2017. Then joined Calcutta University. He had many research papers published in journals of nationally and internationally acclaimed. He has been invited as a person in many seminars, national and international. He has his specialization in 19th and early 20th century writings in English. His research interests include 19th century fiction, Indian writings in English, Indian literature in English, translation, colonial and post-colonial studies. So today he is going to give his deliberation on Faerie Queene. So I welcome you, sir, to this virtual platform, to this online lecture series organized by the Department of English, Midnapore College. And once again, thank you for accepting our invitation to be online and address our participants, sir.
Thank you, Tanmay, and thank you, Shoikat, also. Thank you, Tanmay, especially for introducing me to this wonderful platform. These teachers across the globe, and also I thank the Midnapore College, the autonomous PG department of Midnapore College, for being such a wonderful host. I also thank Niladri for his gracious presence, but it is also a little bit intimidating for me as well, because in a way I have very little to offer, uh, to say, for the great scholars like Niladri. So what I intend to speak this evening is mostly related to the students of the undergraduate and postgraduate levels. And therefore, it's quite fitting for me that I should start with apologies. The first part of my apology is, of course, relating to this audacity that I have ventured into, that in choosing to speak on Spenser, I do prove myself audacious enough of going beyond my limits. So if I say something which is utterly wrong or unacceptable, and if there are any great scholars on Renaissance or Spenser maybe going through this, I humbly stand to be corrected, to be reprimanded if needs be. So that is the first part of my apology. And second part of my apology is directed towards the students for whom I have primarily designed this presentation. Although I have rather ambitiously named the presentation as, or named the part of the text, that is the Faerie Queene, book 1, in the very title of my presentation, the Spenser's Faerie Queene, book 1, and Crisis of Culture. So I don't know how much I will be able to do justice to the text itself. The book 1 itself is a daunting body of poetry, and divided into 12 cantos. So I'm not very sure that how much I'm going to fare really. So I'm actually joining from two devices in this meeting, and now I intend to share the screen if possible before going into my talk further. So can I?
Yes, yes, you can. So I can see that your device is not connected. So you have the option share screen. So if you try to share a screen from that.
I'm trying to enter into the share screen from my computer because my presentation is in my
Yes, yes,
computer, and
yes, yes,
my
yes.
camera is actually operating to the mobile phone. So can I connect my computer to the share screen so that I can show the
Yes, 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 yes,
PPT
yes,
presentation?
yes, yes, yes.
Uh, so okay, share, and okay, so that's it. So
So, sir, make it full.
Okay. Okay. So this is basically the title of my presentation for today evening. Edmund Spenser's The Faerie, Queene, Book 1 and the Crisis of Culture. So let me first begin with something which is a bit personal, an anecdote. Um, I distinctly remember being introduced to Spenser's name when I was in class 8. Uh, and I have such a vivid memory of it because of a very small, perhaps not that significant incident. So we were the student of a Bengali medium school, and we were introduced with the name of Spenser as a part of the history of the European Renaissance, and which was part of the class 8 syllabus, history syllabus. So on the very first day, we were introduced to this, we were asked to read out from our history textbooks in the class for the teacher, for the class itself. And so, as we were going about, one of the first readers of that particular page on history, where the name of Spenser was there as the author of Faerie, Queene, and a great luminary in the galaxy of Shakespeare, was a friend of mine whose family still owns a brass utensil shop in the local market. So he, going by the very Bengali text he has been given with, uh, pronounced the name of Edmund Spenser as Edmondo Spenser, as it goes in the Bengali script. It is Modhan Noy Doy. And so he quite honestly took it to be Mondo. And that was his pronunciation. And the entire class, the teacher laughed out because of this mispronunciation. And he felt very awkward because he was quite honest that he was doing it correctly. And so um, this is how it has passed on to my memory. So later on, when I came to reflect on this incident while doing Spenser a bit more seriously, I found that it was the same kind of awkward feeling with which Spenser himself found when he was in the court of Queen Elizabeth, or at least trying to get some kind of uh, um, advantage, some kind of a focus in the Queen Elizabeth's court, where he perhaps always felt himself to be a kind of a perpetual outsider for many reasons. I'll be coming to that. And the other thing is that in further reflection, it also this small incident of mispronouncing the name of Edmund Spenser is also important for me because it tells another story about this kind of a cultural gap, that what it means to enter into the domain of the culture or to understand culture, that the verbal signs may not be enough for us to get into the very thick of the culture. It requires a different kind of orientation, of course, and this small incident, of course, was a rather painful way of realizing that. Um, Even as classmates of my friend who had mispronounced, we had barely little more idea about Spenser and his performance. But still, and the other thing that on further reflection that I came about to think whenever I think of this incident is that uh, it's not merely the signs that we often tend to misinterpret because of this cultural gap, this crisis of culture, so as to say, but the verbal signs themselves may not always be trustworthy enough. And therefore, when Spenser, who um, mostly championed the style of reading which he called allegory or dark conceit. Uh, is certainly trying to speak about that don't go by the very appearance of the images or the words. uh, they may be misleading, they may be rather illusory. So the allegorical reading, that is reading in the proper sense, or trying to make the proper meaning out of what you read as in terms of say verbal or lexical signs, is much more important. So having said this, let me now come to a sort of brief introduction to the cultural crisis that I am talking about. So I read out a little bit. The idea of culture as we commonly perceive it to be develops out of a stability, or at least a perception of stability in the socio-economic and political life. Critically speaking, any culture is always already in a state of crisis, always found to be in the intersection of varying perceptions of contemporary reality. Spenser's The Faerie Queene, the unfinished masterpiece, remains um, a part of such a cultural project during the reign of Elizabeth I in the late 16th century. But like other great epic narratives, the Fairy Queen is far from being monologic. Spenser writes with a sort of dual perception about his time, that on one hand, he's thinking about his own age in terms of its idealism, um, which is uh, often falling short of the required high idealism. And at the same time, he's also hopeful, is rather optimistic at times, it seems, that these errors can be rectified, or at least an attempt can be made to made in that direction by providing some sort of a workable cultural model. So, as I talk about this workable cultural model, I better start with the very dates, which I think is very important whenever we come to study any particular literary piece, literary text, particularly in connection with the 16th century, the Renaissance. The dates, I think, are extremely important. So Spenser's lifetime is roughly 1552 to 1599 or 98, in that way. So when he was mortally wounded, almost. So it was a life of 46 years. And during that period, since I will be concentrating specifically on the Fairy Queen, um, during Spenser's lifetime, Fairy Queen was published twice, first in 1590 and then in 1596. The 1590 version had the first three books, and that letter, that very famous letter to Sir Walter Raleigh, which is now become a kind of a must preface for the text itself. Um, but in the 1996 version of the text, as it was published with the six books, that letter was dropped. So I'll be coming to that perhaps if I get some more time. And so let us now proceed with some other dates. So Spenser, as I have been saying, that Spenser was a sort of an outsider to the courtly world of Queen Elizabeth. By the time Spenser uh, becomes a sort of a player, or uh, uh, a kind of an employee in the household of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, with whom Elizabeth had a very fond relationship. So Elizabeth has more or less consolidated her position as a queen, and it is a kind of a um, I would say, a question that has already been settled, that the Queen is not going to marry or to have any consort. Uh, so Spenser, uh, coming from a rather poor family in London, goes to Cambridge, Pembroke College, Cambridge, as a sizer or a poor scholar, thriving on the others' donation, and earning his Bachelor of Arts and Masters 1573 and 1576. And also, Cambridge becomes the very place where he strikes this wonderful friendship with Gabriel Harvey. And so, to this Harvey, he later writes about what he is supposed to be doing as a poet. So, this is one of the earliest expressions of his poetic ambition. So, in a letter in 1580, he writes to Harvey that why a god's name may not we, or else the Greeks, have the kingdom of our own language. So, talking in terms of territorial control, uh, talking in terms of linguistic uh, prominence, linguistic superiority. So, Spenser, as a student of the great classics in Cambridge, is now thinking of his ambition of having a domain, a kingdom of our own language. So, um, Spenser's high point in Spenser's career is um, Spenser's appointment to Ireland. He was appointed to the Secretary of Ireland, Lord Grey, and it is a struggle of England against the Irish rebels, to which Spenser gets involved in the later period of his career. And so, as an employee of England in Ireland, he gets to witness something of the terrible machinations or the terrible management of the colonial forces in controlling the rebels in Ireland. So, so the grim realities of that struggle, massacre, the burning of miserable hovels and of crops, with the deliberate intention of starving the inhabitants. So 30,000 people were starved by the English government to bring the Irish in control. So Elizabeth was particularly sensitive about Ireland's position, lest it become a kind of a launching pad for the Catholic Spain to attack on England. So all sorts of measures were undertaken as the part of the crown, and Spenser remains a kind of a dispenser of that imperial justice to the Irish people. And so, a very important question that in one of the introductions to Spenser is raised by the editor is that what does it mean to admire a poet who might, by modern standards, be judged a war criminal, as his master Lord Grey was judged to be, even by the notoriously brutal Elizabethan standards. So the kind of measures that Spenser became a part of were enough in today's humanitarian terms to label him as a war criminal. And Spenser himself wrote about much of these methodologies of the empire um, in a book called View of the Present State of Ireland, a book that ultimately was not published before almost the middle of the 17th century. So that book graphically records many of these repressive measures that the government had undertaken. So, uh, in fact, this is basically where I am trying to problematize our reading of Spenser. And in this brief talk, what I basically can offer is two approaches which are, of course, interrelated. One approach would be to take this crisis of culture in terms of Spenser's being a sort of an outsider, a man seeking some sort of prominence uh, in the royal court by writing poetry. And this is a court which is entirely different from what the idea of court used to be in the time of in the medieval times, or in the pre-Protestant, in the Catholic times. So the system of values, in the system of feudal monarchy, as it was introduced or as it was instituted after this transition into Protestantism, was demanding some very, very vital changes. It may be a little bit of digression, but I just like to add that Spenser's ambition in this regard may be contrasted with one of his predecessors, on whom I have perhaps lectured on other occasions, and he is the author of Utopia, Thomas More. So More belongs to the Catholic period of the Tudor monarchy. The king was in the process of transition, and it is that process that ultimately took away Thomas More's head. But what I just like to focus is that when More joined the service of the king in 1517, he was under great doubts, grave doubts, that serving as an independent scholar, um, the purposes that he could have served, whether they will all be fulfilled by being a servant of a member of the royal court. So More rose to the prominence of being the Lord Chancellor. And his interest in humanist scholarship was something that ran parallel to his office. So Spenser was definitely given a sort of an office, but he was not perhaps satisfied with that. And so now he, from his learning and from the very environment, the social environment of this Protestant England, he now starts entertaining the ambition of making it big in the court with his poetry, with his poetry. But as he will find, the path to it won't be easy. And so this is a slide that perhaps come a little early, but I think it's worthy of going through at this, even at this point, that when Spenser dies in 1599, January 13 January 1599. This is the record that that was taken in, and it was by William Camden, who put it into his annals in Latin, which was later translated into English. That what countrymen of ours worthiest memory died in 1598-99. The third was Edmund Spenser, a Londoner by birth and a scholar also of the University of Cambridge. He always struggled with poverty, though he was secretary to Lord Grey of Ireland. For scarce had he there gotten a solitary place and leisure to ride, when he was cast out of his dwelling and returned to England, a poor man, where shortly after he died. So obviously, poor Spenser, that he ultimately was not able to shrug off that very taint of poverty, even at the time of his death. So if this is the one part, therefore, Spenser's struggle of establishing himself in the role, in a kind of a meaningful role of a poet in the court, in the royal court of the Queen, then, of course, the other part of this, I would say, crisis of culture would be to look at Spenser in his role as um, colonial administrator, and to read his poetry, a kind of a running parallel to his achievements, or rather his engagements, I would say, with this kind of poetry engagements with this management of the state of Ireland. Um, so let me just jump to this slide. This is the first of um, the Fairy Queen's editions, the Fairy Queen, and this is published by William Ponsonby, and um, in 1590, and this is the mark of the printer uh, with the Latin motto. So this is the 1590 version, which had 3 books and a letter in the appendix, and this is um, and this is the dedication page of the 1590 edition. And so the dedication page to the 1590 edition runs something like this. You can read: "To the Most High, Mighty, and the Magnificent Empress Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France, and Ireland, Defender of Faith, etc., your most humble servant." So this version, of course, a little bit of biography may come to our aid, that in 1589, Spenser had the privilege of coming to the court at the behest of his friend, Sir Walter Raleigh, with whom he had got introduced in Ireland. So Raleigh, in fact, Raleigh's going to Ireland is also a part of kind of a imperial English design, that Ireland was deliberately being peopled with the English nobles, so that they could curb, they could root out, they could basically exterminate, eradicate all the rough and savage Irish people from the face of the earth in Ireland. And so Raleigh comes to Ireland, and Spenser, who was somehow trying to get out of Ireland to seek some kind of a position, a better position in England, uh, uh, met Raleigh, and with the help of Raleigh, he wanted to have a very good impression on the Queen, and so that that could have earned him a much better position back in England. So at heart, he was, of course, a Londoner, and so this is the very backdrop into which the first edition of this poem, The Fairy Queen, was published. And it earned some distinction. In fact, the verses in The Fairy Queen, as they stand, they some of them were already in circulation among the Friends in England uh, before it was formally published in 1590. Um, so 1590 publication meets with a reward from the Queen, rather handsome reward, uh, a reward of annual pension of £50. But and Spenser was not relieved of his duties in Ireland. Rather, to his duties, some more responsibilities were added, and Spenser becomes the owner of a larger property later on. And so this is the very backdrop. And before we go to the next edition of this poem, I I would like to draw your attention to another less talked about poem of Spenser, and this is a poem called Prosopopoeia, or Mother Hubbard's Tale. So this Mother Hubbard's Tale is a satire, and this is a satire which is now there's not much talk about it, but this is a satire that somewhere uh, expresses the other side of Spenser's realization about the court. So it was published by Ponsonby once again in 1591, and the two notorious characters in this Mother Hubert's tale are the ape and the fox, who were once again allegorically imitating some of the villainous characters who were hovering around the queen herself in the court itself, and so who were making the life rather difficult for Spenser. And so, and this is one of the earliest editors of Spenser's work, John Hughes. And John Hughes writes in 1715 that everyone will observe that the keenness of wit with which Spenser has represented the art of ill courtiers in the description of a good courtier, which is so finely set off by the contrary characters, is believed the author had in his view Sir Philip Sidney, of whom this seems to be a very just as well a beautiful picture. So Sidney was, of course, the good man in this version of this courtly satire, but the ape and the fox and actually representing the ill courtiers, the arts of the ill courtiers. And so this is the version, and I would like to draw your attention to another of the text, which was also published before this second version of the Faerie Queene was published in 1596. Uh, and this is called uh, a poem called Calling Clouds Come Home Again. So Calling Clouds Come Home Again is actually a continuation of satire, not a satire, but a bucolic poem called The Shepherd's Calendar, uh, uh, which I have not mentioned so far in my lecture because that happens to be Spenser's earliest of the notable works that uh, got some kind of a prominence. So that work too was published in 1591. So this is the 1595. This is the title page of the 1595 version. But with me, I have the text of the 1591, the first published edition of Calling Clouds Come Home Again. So a bit of annotation is required perhaps to introduce Calling Clouds into this discussion. That Calling Clouds happens to be one of the characters in Spenser Shepherd's Calendar, and he is one of those shepherds who aspired to be a poet, and therefore he left his band of fellow shepherds in search of the poetic eminence. And so Colin Cloud is definitely a sort of an alter ego for Spenser, the aspiring poet. And so now in this poem, we have a situation where Colin Cloud is coming back to his shepherd friends. And it is from him, therefore, these rustics, these shepherds, are getting a glimpse of what happens in the court or how far he has actually fared in how successful he had actually been in the court where he had been an aspirant poet. And I read from the letter of this poem, and this letter was um, addressed once again to Sir Walter Raleigh, the right worthy and the noble knight. And um, this letter expresses something of of the personal grief that Spenser have felt in his attempt to seek prominence as a poet. So I read out, Sir, that you may see that I am not always idle as the king, though not greatly well occupied, not altogether undutiful, though not precisely officious. I make you present of this simple pastoral, unworthy of your higher concept, for the meanness of the style, but agreeing with the truth in circumstance and matter. Uh, I skip some lines. The which I humbly beseech you to accept, and in part payment of the infinite debt in which I acknowledge myself bounden unto you for your singular favors and sundry good turns showed to me at my late being in England, and with your good countenance protect against the malice of the evil mouths, which are always wide open to carp at the and misconstrue my simple meaning. I pray continually for your happiness. So this is a letter which is written from Spenser's house in Kilcolman, as it is mentioned in the end of the letter itself. And so Spenser uh, somehow bidding a kind of a farewell to this rather um, competitive world of the English court in London and going back to Ireland with this kind of a farewell note to Sir Walter Raleigh. And it is precisely this malice of evil mouths which has pained him a lot, and also this tendency to misconstrue my simple meaning. So Spenser, as I've been telling, that was thinking in terms of the proper interpretation of a poet's language, a poet's tongue. So he's talking about allegory of the dark conceit, and if it is not properly interpreted, then of course it may create an havoc. And so, with these two poems in between the two editions of the Faerie Queene, we now come to the 1596 edition of the Faerie Queene, disposed into 12 books. The 12 books were never realized. It was rather an ambitious project, and it's a different printer this time, 1596, but the publisher was the same. And another thing, this 1596 version is trying to project is, instead of Raleigh, as I have already said, that the letter to Raleigh, which was there in the first version of the poem, not as a preface, of course, but as a kind of an appended part to the text itself. Now it has become a kind of a standard preface, as I have already said. So instead of that letter was completely dropped, and now we have a dedication page which is slightly longer than it was in the first version. To the most high, mighty, and magnificent Empress, renowned for piety, virtue, and all gracious government, Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France, and Ireland, and of Virginia. So England has recently bagged Virginia, and Sir Walter Raleigh definitely had a share in this colonial explorations. The defender of the faith, etc., our most humble servant Edmund Spenser doth in all humility dedicate, present, and consecrate these his labors to live with the eternity of her fame. So now, somewhere it seems as a subtext. I can see it as a sort of a subtext coming out of this dedication page, that entire devotion is converging on the goodness of the self of the Queen herself. The two poems that I have just talked about, Mother Hubert's Tale and Calling Clouds Come Home Again, um, in both these poems, particularly in Calling Clouds Come Home Again, Elizabeth is seen to be someone who is not at all affected by this kind of politicking around herself. And so she is rather resplendent in her glory. In Calling Clouds Come Home Again, she is Cynthia. So um, now, therefore, this 1596 version, which has got three more books, and those of you who have a fair idea will definitely agree that the last three books are not always celebratory. They are very, very problematic in certain places. Um, and along with these six books was published the Mutability Cantos, and so now it is no longer perhaps a desire to have a kind of a earthly distinction or distinguish himself as in the role of a court poet, much in the manner of the classical poets. So now it is a devotion to Queen herself, and without any, I would say, courtly ambition, so as to say. So, so how much time do I have? If I
Yes, you can continue. We have.
okay.
Uh,
Uh, so let me now just come to some parts of the text itself. So Raleigh's letter, as I have been discussing, that which was dropped in the 1596 edition, it still remains a very important prefatory note because it actually introduces us to the story. And without this kind of a background story, and of course, Spenser's intention of fashioning forth gentlemen um, with noble virtues is something the book is to fashion a gentleman or noble person in virtuous and gentle discipline, and therefore this book is conceived as a part of that project, and this is to be read as a sort of a dark conceit, as Spenser talks about, but more importantly, on from the point of the narrative, it provides the necessary background, without which perhaps we cannot immediately get connected to the very first scene of what exactly is happening in the text of the book one, so as to say. So it is the situation where we have, I'm not reading out, but I do have to go back to this background story where the basic thing is that a person of rather unspecified social origin, I would say it in this way, uh, is rising up to the occasion when someone, so it is the court of Queen Gloriana, the fairy queen, and in this court comes a distressed lady whose parents have been captured by some foul monster. And so now this queen is in search of a worthy man who is capable of undertaking this errand of this responsibility of freeing the parents of Una. So we find it is not, I would say, a noble knight, or rather, instead, the person who comes forward is of unspecified um, social origin, I would say. Um, the first was this: in the beginning of the feast, there presented himself a tall, clownish young man who, falling before the Queen of Fairies, desired a boon. So, the man is described as to be clownish in the sense of having the garb of a rustic. So this self-fashioning, therefore, is already at work. We can see that this clownish man, if he is the very other self, the alter ego of Spenser himself, then he is now in search of the glory which is much more fit to his person. So, falling before the Queen of Fairies, desired a boon, as the manner then was, which during the feast she might not refuse, which was that he might have the achievement of any adventure which during that feast should happen, that being granted, he rested him on the floor, unfit though his rusticity for a better place. So it is a sort of a boon that gets granted ultimately in the form of getting this opportunity to serve the queen, to go for an adventure, go for an errand at the behest of the queen. And so it is therefore the other thing that I would like to draw attention to my listeners is that this mention of the feast, which is rather consciously done. So Spenser was, as he rather ambitiously talked about in 1580, that he was keen enough to proliferate, to extend the domain, the kingdom of our own language. So he has been an avid reader of the English literature of past, which were slowly coming in print. And so by the end of the 16th century, many of them were there in print. So this idea of the feast and this feast time adventure was therefore a part of the Romance tradition, that native English Romance tradition. So the readers of the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight will definitely agree with me that it is actually a feast into which the Green Knight rides in, and it is that feast where this challenge is thrown and this challenge is accepted rather playfully. So it is this feast which makes things rather jestfully possible. It is this, but for Spenser, this is very important. This feast is important in other respect, that here the feast, it is because of these feasts, this rather kind of a dreamlike, playful situation, which makes it possible for the queen to give the responsibility to this rather clownish man. Uh, Otherwise, I would argue that had it been a kind of a normal social situation, um, the claimants for such an adventure would come only from the domain of landed aristocracy. So it is the landed aristocrats who, even I would say, historically speaking, in the Protestant times were not at all diminished, or rather, they were trying to reinvent their social roles um, in different ways. So perhaps in a real situation, uh, the turn would come only for such landed aristocrats, the hereditary owners of landed property, to serve the queen in any such job, any such adventure like this. So this is the feast, and therefore it makes possible that it is this clownish man who is now being entrusted with this uh, responsibility on freeing the parents of Una. Uh, so much so for the letter. I better now move ahead. Um, the proem part, of course, which is the first part of book one, and in a way, it actually shows the very itself of the poet, or rather, in brief, it tells about the entire project of the Faerie Queen. And once again, it is the poet now who is speaking, directly, rather, uh, that a poet who had been previously donned the dress of the shepherd. So the lowly shepherd's weeds. And so now he is set out to sing of knights and ladies' gentle deeds, whose praises, having slept in silence long, me all to me the sacred muse reads, to blazon broad amongst her learned throng. So blazon broad among her learned throng. Once again, the ambition is coming to the forefront. And so it is this desire that is now emboldening, it is now making the path clear for the poet. And so he is seeking the help of the muses, Holy Virgin, Chief of Nine, um, and to Cupid he appeals for help. Um, and finally, in the fourth stanza of this poem, we come to the last part of this invocation. And with them eke, O goddess, heavenly bright, mirror of grace and majesty divine, great lady of the greatest isle, whose light like Phoebus' lamp throughout the world doth shine. Shed thy fair beams into my feeble eyne, and raise my thoughts to humble and to vile. To think of that true glorious type of thine, the argument of mine afflicted style, the which to hear vouchsafe, O dearest dread awhile. So the very imagery of this last stanza almost imitates the very ritual of the Queen anointing any individual with the knighthood. And so this is what is expected the Queen from the Queen, that I may be uh, granted with that kind of a eminence with the writing of this poem. And so we move ahead, and I come next to the first canto. I think I okay. So the very first part of the canto introduces us to this. It's a very very dynamic scene, and I always have almost goosebumps whenever I read these lines aloud because they are rather picturesque on, I would say, cinematic. That they seem like a moving picture that a gentle knight was spritten on the plain, a clad in mighty arms and silver shield, wherein old dints of deep wounds did remain, the cruel marks of many a bloody field. Yet arms still that time did he never wield. And so this is the first point of contradiction, therefore, that this armor, which is first described as mighty arms in silver shield, wherein old deeds of deep wounds did remain. So it is an armor which is battle worn, almost like the armor of the knight in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But here, immediately after that, we have a line that says something extremely, entirely contradictory, that yet arms till that time did he never wield. So how come, therefore, that this armor is dinted with so many battle marks, and yet this person who is wearing it had never wielded any arm so far? The only answer is, of course, that it is not his, that it is a kind of a borrowed armor, or the person who is now wearing it has to grow up to prove himself worthy of that battle-worn armor. Yet arms till that time did he never wield, His angry steed did chide his foaming bit, as much disdaining to the curb to yield. Full jolly knight he seemed, and fair did sit, as one of the knightly jest and fierce encounters fit. So the reality and the picturesque or rather outward appearance. So the last two lines is actually voted to this kind of a scenic, this picturesque appearance of this jolly knight who is fit for knightly jests and encounters. Once again, we are thrown back, we are taken back to the world of the medieval romances where the knights were part of this kind of a courtly performance or courtly show where they were made to perform the jests and encounters, the tournaments into which they were constantly taking part. But at the same time, there are occasions where these tournaments, this game playing, were turning into something much more real and serious, as it happens in case of Sir Gavin. Sir Gavin's story, Sir Gavin and the Green Knight, where this challenge, which rather begins rather jestfully, is turning into a game of life and death as it proceeds, as it advances. And so the armor of Sir Gavin, if uh, some of my readers can, some listeners can immediately recall that how it has been described in by that anonymous poet in that version. Uh, Gavin's armor too is a kind of a seasoned armor, and with the memory of that, let us now proceed to the next second stanza. But on his breast a bloody cross he bore, the dear remembrance of his dying lord, for whose sweet sake that glorious badge he wore, and dead as living ever him adored. Upon his shield the like was also scored, for sovereign hope, which in his help he had. Right faithful, true he was in deed and word, but of his cheer did seem to solemn sad. Yet nothing did he dread, but ever was he glad. So with the memory of Gavin's armor, with that famous pentangle, we now come to the description of this armor with this bloody cross. It is this armor that gives the identity and also the name to this very individual who is riding as as we find him riding. So on his breast a bloody cross he bore, the dear remembrance of his dying lord. So of course the duality of meaning can be immediately seen that this bloody cross is uh, something that was a remembrance of his dying lord, which may be an earthly lord, um, but there may be a lot of um, allegorical or symbolic interpretations of that. Um, and of course, this dying Lord, by the common Christian understanding, is referring to Jesus Christ, uh, who had been crucified for the sins of the world. So, dying Lord is by the common general Christian understanding is representing uh, um, Jesus Christ. But we have to keep in mind, and this is where this kind of a um, problematizing approach sets in, that Sir Gavin and the Green Knight is a poem which was definitely, although we don't know who exactly wrote that poem, but we know that it was written at a time when there was no shadow of any rivalry to the Catholic faith. So it was written in Catholic England, and where this idea of faith was basically united by a sense of piety. And so the knight in Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, um, like Sir Gawain in the Gavin and the Green Knight, they were all basically being a part of this kind of a pan-Christian, this Catholic, which literally means the universal. So this Catholic world uh, of as the defenders of the faith, and so that was a different world. But Spenser is um, conscious that now when the Fairy Queen is written, there is a shift. It is the world has changed, and now the allegiance to faith is no longer a kind of a unproblematized, unified idea. So, can we see this Red Cross Knight somewhere trying to live up to idea of a Protestant heroism, trying to be a very model of the Protestant um, cultural ethics of the feudal culture. The feudal culture, of course, involves the religious aspect. So, can we see the Red Cross Knight, therefore, as a kind of a defender of this Protestant idea of heroism? And in that light, can we say that this cross that he is actually bearing is a kind of a residual memory of the past, of that glorious past, perhaps, uh, uh, to which all true Christians, Protestant or Catholic, had to look back to. And so, to balance, therefore, we have the introduction of Una, or this oneness of faith, uh, the true faith, the one who is accompanying the Red Cross Knight, or rather, the Red Cross Knight is made to accompany Una. So, upon a great adventure, he was born, the greatest Gloriana to him gave, the greatest glorious queen of fairy lawn, to win him worship and race to have, which of all earthly things he most did crave, and ever as he rode, his heart did earn to prove his cushions in battle brave. And so Una is introduced. A lovely lady rode him fair beside, upon a lowly ass, more white than snow. Yet she much whiter, but the same did hide under a veil that wimple was full low, and over all a black stole she did throw. So Una, or this true faith, uh, whom the Red Cross Knight accompanies, is the very epitome of humility, of lowliness, and so he is therefore to be defended, and he is therefore to be supported. So I think I have already um, it's 8 or 9. So how long can I continue this? Of course, I have to. Tonmoy, are you there?
Yes, yes, Dada. So
Uh,
my battery will get adjusted soon.
So I should not try the patience of my wonderful listeners. Niladrida
They
initially.
are, but the listeners they are watching still. They are listening to you.
Okay, okay, okay. So the last thing from the text that I would like to talk about in the time remaining is that one of the first adventures that the Red Cross Knight is drawn into is the killing of the foul error. So, and the entire trajectory, the description of the very terrain, the very layer where this monster, foul error, is residing, is at once reminiscent of Spenser's reading of the wealth of Middle and Old English poetry. It definitely reminds us of Walt, of course, the way this foul error is being approached, and the way this dame error, this the mother suckling the babies from his poisonous breast, is being found. So this killing of the foul error is one of the first adventures the knight is drawn into. But at the same time, what we can read is that in um, in imagining, or rather painting the very surroundings to the lair of this foul monster, foul error, Spenser is also perhaps taking in some of his Irish experience. So it is actually a tale of ambush, and this is how perhaps the Irish rebels were smoked out of their hideouts when the imperial forces laid siege upon their properties, upon their hovels, so as to say. So, to cut the story short, this foul error proves to be a sort of a um, rather challenging enemy for the Red Cross Knight, who, if we remember the narrative in the early stage, had never wielded uh, the sword. And so this challenge is rather a formidable one, that a man who has not been into any kind of battle is for the first time is encountering this uh, duel with the foul error. And so this is a difficult battle where the ups and downs are rather graphically described, that at one point Red Cross Knight is completely under the grip of the foul error, which whenever I read this particular line, I, fi- I find the line to be rather metaphorically evocative, that Red Cross Knight is under the grip of foul error, and errors, the invisible errors that often clutter our understanding of our true self, often prove to be the real impediments in our self fashioning, in our self realization. So, and these errors are very difficult to fight against. And I come to the last part of this battle, where this foul error is finally slain. Una helps the Red Cross Knight into this job, and with the help of Una, the knight is able to slay the foul error. And then what comes out of the foul error's body is something remarkable, that it is, I would say, from our point of view of culture studies, uh, a wealth of uh, printed materials, which we now value much for our understanding of the uh, early modern world of England. And so it is this wealth of uh, printed material, which included the Catholic propaganda. And so Spenser writes, her vomit full of books and papers was. So books and papers are commonly interpreted as the Catholic propaganda. But if we just once again try to be a little bit of culturally alive to this development of the early modern world in England, then we may think of the cultural world being flooded with books, which were otherwise also known as pamphlets in the late 16th century. And so these books and pamphlets were flooding the world of the marketplace, and these books and pamphlets had earned their notoriety uh, uh, precisely because they were disseminating information which were not always true, and they were the very hotbeds of vices, of I would say rumors, false rumors, and strange stories about strange people. Um, in fact, I'd just like to go back to one of the earlier slides in my presentation, and this one. So, Mother Hubert's Tale was published by William Ponsonby, and William Ponsonby's address is described as the dwelling in Paul's churchyard at the figure of the bishop's head. So, this St. Paul's churchyard was the very marketplace for print where uh, the booksellers, or rather peddlers or hawkers, used to peddle with the cry, buy a new book, buy a new book. And these new books were uh, kind of either folio or quarto versions, and they were rather thinly printed materials on very cheap kind of paper. And so Spenser himself was not free from that, because as you can see that his own work was basically published from such a place, such a printer. And so it is this books and pamphlets, the very plethora of it was, which was often labeled as a kind of a say the very seat of all the uh, bad things that are being peddled in the society, or the very hotbed of the vices. Just like now we blame the internet for being so vicious, being so problematic in its approach. So that was perhaps the status of the print culture. And so this Red Cross trying to fight against this foul error is in a way trying to fight against this kind of a world of the marketplace of print, which was becoming rather uncontrollable even after the establishment of the stationer's register uh, in during Queen Elizabeth's reign. So it's 18 minutes past 8. So I better come to the conclusion. So Spenser is a poet of sensuous images and yet also something of an iconoclast, deeply suspicious of the power of the images, material and verbal, to turn into idols. He is an idealist drawn to courtesy, gentleness, and exquisite moral refinement, yet also a celebrant of English nationalism, empire, and martial power. He is the author of the most memorable literary idealization of Elizabeth I, yet he fills his poem with coded criticisms of the Queen. He is in some way a backward-looking poet who paid homage to Chaucer, used archaic language, and compared his own age unfavorably with the feudal past. So, um, if it is true, this is from Stephen Greenblatt, with whom I would rather hastily like to wind up this discussion. So, if it is true that we are highly sensitive to those aspects of Renaissance that mark the early tentative conflict-ridden fashioning of modern consciousness, then the Fairy Queen is of quite exceptional significance. For Spenser's stated intention is precisely to fashion a gentleman or noble person in virtuous and gentle discipline. This mirroring the conscious purpose of the work, seeming to enact the larger cultural movement may help to account for the reader's sense of encountering in Spenser's poem the process of self-fashioning itself. Uh, and this is a bit longer quotation, which I'd like to conclude. And this is also from Stephen Greenblatt's chapter on the myth of self-fashioning, on chapter on Spenser, that Spenser is one of the first English writers to have what we may call a field theory of culture. That is, the conception of a nation not simply as an institutional structure or a common race, but as a complex network of beliefs, folk customs, forms of dress, kinship relations, religious mythology, aesthetic norms, and specialized modes of production. Therefore, to reform a people, one must not simply conquer it, though conquest is an absolute necessity. So you may take it or you may challenge it. It's up to you. But this is the way Greenblatt somewhere tries to make a synthesis between Spenser's experience as a colonizer, as a colonizing administrator in Ireland, and his cultural role as a sort of an epic poet. So, though conquest is an absolute necessity, but eradicate the native culture in the case of Ireland, eliminate by force wherever needed the carols, horseboys, gestures, and other idlers, transform the mass of the rural population from the cowherds with their dangerous freedom of movement to husbandmen, break up for the clans or sects, prohibit public meetings, councils, and assemblies, transform Irish art, prohibit the subversive epics of the bards, make school children ashamed of their parents' backwardness, discourage English settlers from speaking Irish, prohibit traditional Irish dress, eliminate elections of chief divisible inheritance and the payment of the fines to avoid capital punishment. And always in this immense undertaking, there is the need for constant vigilance and unrelenting pressure exercised not only upon the wild Irish but upon the civilizing English themselves. So I conclude with the note that it is that same cultural crisis that we may have noticed or may find rather critically active when we come to the 19th century colonizing experience of India, that the experience that Spenser had in the late 16th century, where his poem basically tries to talk about civilizing the English themselves, is a part of his reflection on this so-called crisis of culture. And this crisis of culture was once again reopened in a bigger, in a larger stage when we may have the occasion to talk about the colonizing process of the Indian subcontinent. So thank you for the time being and thank you for your wonderful patience. So that's it. Over to you, Tanmay.
Thank you, sir, for this engaging and all informative session. And now, without further delay, I will invite questions from the participants with your permission. Uh, so, sir, then we can have questions from the participants as they are asked to write them down in the comment section. So, I'm just making it visible on the screen.
This is Shaista Rahman, and the question is: can we locate post-colonial perspective in Spenser's Faerie Queene? Definitely, this is what I have been driving to. That when you take the idea of the post-colonial from say talking about beyond talking about India or the Indian subcontinent or Africa, then you can definitely apply it because the methodologies by which the imperial power operates were almost the same. And this Irish part of Spenser's identity, or this role of Spenser in, and not only Spenser's role, I would say that the British imperial policies in Ireland in this early 16th century needs to be discussed. Ireland perhaps was not that commercially important for England, but it is actually this dual purpose of civilizing Ireland as well as having a kind of a effective territorial and political control over this territory that rather goads the English crown towards controlling Ireland. So definitely. So this is Sushanta Kumar Shahu. What is the thrust of Edmund Spenser's epic poem flooded with culture, and will it compared with Indian classical epic poem? Uh, well, um, I don't know whether I am in a position to answer this question, because it requires a fair knowledge of the variety of the Indian classical epic poem. So, if it means by Indian classical epic poem, if you are suggesting Ramayana and Mahabharata, then of course Spenser's project is completely a different one. Uh, the cultural reference in Spenser's poem, this, if we take it as a kind of an unfinished epic, is definitely a secondary form of an epic, and there is nothing there which rather comes given. Each and everything is rather constructed. Niladri a little while ago was talking about this craft of a poet. This poetic act is somewhere residing in this craftsmanship of the poet, this masterful stroke of the poet as a craftsman. So Spenser, I take, is not that kind of a Homeric epic poet. Rather, his model was Virgil, and as Virgil was to the court of Emperor Augustus, uh, Spenser was trying to visualize himself in such a role with respect to the court of Queen Elizabeth I. So this is Ogrima Mishra. Sir, do you think that the introduction of visual portraits of the writers while reading the history of literature will help us to avoid this cultural crisis? First of all, let me answer in this way that cultural crises are not supposed to be avoided. Rather, we have to embrace them. We have to be very alive and very acutely conscious about their existence. Um, as I have said in my presentation, that all forms of culture are always already in a state of crisis. And therefore, we should not be under any kind of illusion that how can we avoid this crisis of culture. Uh, of course, during the colonial period, and even after, long after, say, I would say that the very methodologies of teaching, learning, and appreciating European literature, especially English literature in India, had basically thrived upon this idea of bridging this cultural gap, this ending once and for all this cultural crisis. Either there were several methodologies. One was, of course, going into the very thick of the culture itself. You get so immersed that it ultimately makes you at least vicariously a part of that culture. Or you may simply go on talking about the universal qualities of literature, of the cultural universal values of the culture, which will definitely make you come out of this crisis. But I don't think any such garb or any such uh, I would say curtains are no longer required. The times we are living in, it has basically mm, uh, exposed everything. And so, uh, okay, I've been shocked with the next question, and that is, can we relate Fairy Queen with More's Utopia? Um, Whoever has posed the question, this is Rita Pradhan. A bit careful about uh, the spelling of More. It should be M-O-R-E, because M-O-O-R-E More actually refers to another More who happens from the Irish origin, a contemporary, or rather, an elder contemporary of the Romantic poets, famous for his Irish melody. So I think you are talking about M-O-R-E More, Thomas More, the author of Utopia. Uh, the point that I made as a sort of digression was a kind of a comparison between this um, courtly ambition of More, or rather the absence of uh, the courtly ambition on the part of More as a humanist scholar, and Spenser's ambition to shine in the court. So that may be contrasted as two individual attitudes. That may also be contrasted because of two very different kinds of orientations. More came from a rather privileged family, and More was More came from a family of lawyers, and More himself was quite a successful lawyer. He was hired, I would say, he was commissioned by the king for royal errands because of his wonderful service long before he became the part of the royal service. And so it was the king who wanted him to be a part of his retinue, to be a part of his office. Um, and More was obviously divided uh, uh, about what to do, because one of the contemporaries of More, that is Erasmus, uh, had a very strong view against the idea of the workings of the monarchy, and therefore he was sown to poverty, and he died a poor man, and he never attached himself to any particular um, monarchy or any court, despite being a brilliant scholar himself. And so in Utopia, we find that a part of More's own doubt, as well as a part of Erasmus's rejection of the court, is being reflected uh, on the part of Hypnodes' narration, Raphael Hypnodes' narration, that how he finds that the court to be rather wanting and full of all the wrong kind of people who won't allow the truly talented, truly important voice to thrive or prosper, or to advise the state in a better way. So Spenser was definitely not trying to see his role as that of a royal counselor, as Raphael Hypnodes rejects in Utopia, or More ultimately adopted in his own career. But in a way, he wanted a role in the court, because he believed, and I think he honestly believed, that for the functioning of a proper idealistic cultural enterprise, the poet has a very important and a glorious role to play. Okay, so Rita again, and what he actually mean of why in God's name and we, as the else, have the kingdom of our own language. So the question of kingdom of our own language is rather important in the late 16th century. Once again, since I was talking about More, let me go back to him. More's Utopia was written in Latin, and it was intended, it was published for the first time, not from England, but from the continent. And so it was written in Latin, and during More's lifetime, the several versions of Utopia that were printed all were in Latin. So perhaps More had not much faith about the wealth of the English language. And therefore, for any learned communication, conversation, Latin was the lingua franca among the continental scholars. So this is an indicator to what status the English language was actually found to be. One of the other very, very commonly read texts, which can be rather carefully read to find this kind of a suspicion about the capacity of English language, is Sir Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. So English as a fit language for high cultural expression was not accepted. More's Utopia was for the first time translated in 1554 or 1556, that almost a decade after More was beheaded in 1535. And so this proves that English as a language had a very difficult status. But at the same time, this later half of the 16th century was being flooded with printed texts, and many of these earliest printers were printing texts from the English sources, the Old and Middle English sources, and so the vast wealth of the English language was being opened to, say, sensitive and careful minds, critical minds like that of Spenser. So it is that, I think, along with their university background, which make them so very expectant, so very ambitious of having a kingdom of our own language. So this is Priyankar. How can we bring
This is the last question,
how can
sir.
we bring a view of the state to Ireland, mentioning the customs and religion effect criticized at a point of inspiration for playwrights like King or Ibsen to focus in Irish reform movement? So as I think this is taking us a little bit away from the Faerie theme, and I don't find myself prepared enough to talk about the impact of Spenser's Irish tract on the later development of the Irish reform movement. But this much I can say is that, as I have already told, that this tract was not published until 1633. So in Spenser's lifetime, it was not published, and the gruesomeness with which the repressive policies of the English crown was actually followed was revealed later. I don't know how can I integrate Ibsen's focus on the Irish reform movement. Ibsen was a Norwegian playwright, right? So I'm not right in a position to talk about Ibsen, but Sting was, of course, coming from, I would say, margin of the margins, that if Ireland itself was having a kind of a marginal status to the metropolitan English culture, then of course Sing belonged to the Aran Islands, which was rather marginal to the mainland of Ireland. So I think their expression of cultural resilience comes in the form of a strange, I would say, native form of resistance through resilience that we may be barbaric, we may have a very different country to live in, we may have a climate which is still very hostile, but still our nativity, our affiliation, uh, our adherence to our own culture, our local culture, demands that we should live and die with it. So that is kind of a resilience which no imperial power, I guess, had the power to curb or smoke out or to burn or to scorch. So this resilience still thrives, it still lives on. This game of or this battle between the metropolis and the margin is still on, and it is with respect to that larger, I would say, global picture. I would like to see Singh's defense of the Irish life, the Irish reforms. Um, I hope you are not fully satisfied, but I think I'm not in a position to add much right at this moment.
Thank you, sir.
Mm. The pleasure is all
Uh,
mine.
yes, no. It's okay. Now we are for the formal vote of thanks, and for that I request our students, Sanchari Bhokta, to give you the formal vote of thanks. Sanchari, are you there?
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. It's my honor and privilege to deliver a vote of thanks on behalf of Midnapore College Autonomous Department of English. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to our distinguished speaker, Professor Debapriya Paul, for such an informative and insightful lecture on Spenser's The Faerie, Book 1 and Crisis of Culture. Then, I also like to take a moment to thank our HOD sir, Professor Tanmay Kundu, for his immense contribution to democratize the knowledge by organizing this lecture series. Now, I would like to give a hearty Dr. G.C. Peda for his unconditional cooperation and the participants also for their active participation. Thank you very much, sir, once again for such an excellent speech.